Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Un cordial saludo. 10 con
Welcome and greetings. At 10:05, we welcome you all to the RCM, and we want to tell you that this activity has simultaneous interpretation. If you are going to use the floor, try to speak in slowly, and when you're not using the floor, please close your mics. And also, regarding the use of the information publication and other media, any reproduction or dissemination of this content in whole or part, live or recorded, in any means is forbidden. And any request for reproduction will have to be handled via the Executive Secretariat. Once again, welcome on the workshop for strengthening intergovernmental policies. Today, we are going to have the second session on the evaluation of use of force and protection. I'm pleased to welcome Ruth Villanueva Castilleja, General Director of Protection to Migrants and Migration of the Mexican National Migration Institute. So you have the floor. And I think that you have the microphone closed.
Ok, perfecto.
Okay. Welcome, morning all. With this presentation, we are going to start today's meeting, and I want to start by thanking everybody for being with us today, the second session, virtually, of course, on the use of force within the context of migration. And the results that we've had with yesterday's activities and today's will continue strengthening public policies. And I want to read a few remarks to welcome you all, especially taking into account the objectives and topic of the discussion. I would say that for a long time, human migration has been a social protection strategy for thousands around the world. Either looking for better opportunities, fleeing violence or extreme poverty, or political persecution, people migrate because they want a better life, a decent life. For many, the objective is to live better, but just migrating entails risks and uncertainty. We know that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We have witnessed that globalization, technological advance have improved communication and transportation. So these trips are increasingly safe and affordable. So the facility for movement and inequality, both political and economic, around the world, has spurred the flow of not only people, but goods and ideas. So transnational migration flows have generated a series of instruments by the countries to try to manage these migration flows, especially irregular migration flows. So states must recognize migrants are holders of human rights that have to be respected at all times, regardless of migration status. That is why we need to take into account that the conflicts and crises that compel many to migrate do not generate spontaneously. They are usually transnational or regional in nature. And given the complexity and increase of migration flows around the world, especially Latin America, we have more and more challenges to provide assistance and protection to these people. So countries have to collaborate, establishing intergovernmental policies for migration management. The region constituted by the RCM countries, mass and irregular migration is still present due to a series of structural conditions in the region, like lack of opportunity, poverty, inequality, and public insecurity. However, this is why we need to make progress in regional cooperation to address the structural um, causes that spur migration from a perspective of human rights and also a gender perspective. However, people will keep on migrating, so we need to provide respect, non-discrimination, equal treatment, and also taking into account situations of vulnerability and procedures for protection or regulation. We can have alternative mechanisms to detention, minimal use of force, and the offer of return programs. Respecting human rights of migrants is a challenge for the countries in the region, especially if you take into account that discrimination towards this population automatically affects their exercise of their rights, like well-being, dignity, and even security. Thus, we have to recognize the rules that govern the use of force by public or government officials. That is why it is important to make progress in training for the establishment of the regional agreements and their implementation. That is why we celebrate within the framework of the Mexico PPT, the being able to have or take steps as a region to guarantee the respect of the rights of people within the context of mobility. That is why, for me, I'm pleased to welcome and greet you, and on behalf of Mr. Carmen Yañez. So today's session reaches the stated objectives and be most fruitful, so we can continue working for the benefit of everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Villanueva, for your welcoming remarks. Today's session is being supported by the International Committee of the Red Cross. So Monica Oel, legal counsel of the regional delegation for Mexico and Central America of the ICRC. Monica, you have the floor. Morning all from the ICRC. First, thank you for being with us today on this regional conference on migration. Welcome to the second session that is going to deal with the use of force and protection of populations within the context of migration. For the ICRC, it is a privilege because migration is a situation that involves more than one country, usually regions, even the world. So it requires regional and international responses. So this is a perfect space to be able to talk about regional international standards, best practices by different countries, so we can achieve a guarantee of the rights of migrants. So today, what we seek is to have a focus on the shared responsibility and human rights and for the protection of migrants. The session is going to be facilitated by me and my colleague. First, we're going to talk first about general settings or an overview, then talk about the use of force, and finally protection, and then a space to share best practices in the region regarding this topic. So we can share best practices and look for actions that would guarantee the rights of migrant populations. So it's a pleasure being with you, and welcome to the second session. Thank you, Monica. We hope that this second session be fruitful. According to certain indications, I would like to give the floor to Gustavo Pineda, coordinator of the working group of irregular mass migration of the RCM and director of public policy of the migration policy, registration and population of the Ministry or Secretariat of the Interior of Mexico. Thank you. Morning, Luis Alonso, Monica. And of course, I would like to remind you that the objective of today's session is to know about international frameworks and the evaluation of the use of force against migrant populations, which is a very important topic for the countries in the region, in this regional conference, and that these international standards and best practices that are carried out in different countries can be translated into public policies for the rest of the country. It's very important for all to translate this to the practice of public servants who service migrant populations. And these workshops are for continuity. Yesterday, we had non-discrimination, and we've had some opinions of member countries, which is, and the basic one would be to build a regional strategy to assist irregular migrants or migrants in irregular situation. And this is tied to non-discrimination, the standards of the use of force, and the topic we will see tomorrow, which is assisted return within the context of crisis. And human rights is one of the main components, of course, that we have to have in this regional strategy. And it's going to be one of the most important aspects to which we have to pay attention, with the objective being to assist populations within the context of mobility throughout the region. Again, on behalf of the working group on irregular mass migration, welcome all, and you are cordially invited to have the recording of the first session as well. So yesterday's and today's session continue to help us build this regional strategy and policy. And as I said yesterday, one of the pillars of this working group or main activities is, of course, to put to the consideration of the member countries a regional strategy. And this is why we have these three alternative activities as essential components to make progress on this regional strategy, and we can continue providing assistance and protection to migrants throughout our region. Thank you, Luis Alonso. And let's hope this session and tomorrow on Friday's session will be most fruitful. Thank you for this introduction. And as we said before, this activity of today is going to be facilitated by the Red Cross. So Monica, Ella, legal counsel, and Ana Luisa, Cinta. And let's try with the presentation, and let's try to speak a little bit slowly to facilitate a bit the interpretation. And then we will share some of the trigger questions that we will also put in the chat. But leaving everybody in very good hands. And thank you, ICRC, for your support. Morning all. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to take a few seconds to put or give a context of the institution. The International Committee of the Red Cross has a strictly humanitarian mandate to defend or protect the standards of war. And many or for many years, it has been understood that countries like this region encounter situations of violence that will result in humanitarian consequences. And that is why the ICRC also works in countries such as ours, in as well as the rest of the continent. Right now, we are present in 90 countries. And in these scenarios, we are still the guardian of international humanitarian rights in the region to protect and assist victims of situations of violence. And we know that a population that has become a victim due to the causes that the National Institute of Migration was sharing, in other words, the causes for human mobility, many times is due to violence. And we intend to protect all people, including migrant populations. And now we are going to present with Monica, and we are going to talk about the legal context and the rights of human rights. And remember, as we heard before, migrants are holders of human rights. They have human rights. After her presentation, we are going to talk about use of force vis-a-vis migrants. We're going to review cases, if there are specific standards, etc. Monica, you have the floor. Well, welcome again. I tend to speak a bit quickly. I'll try to slow down a bit. And another thing that I want to say, and you can interrupt me or you can write in the chat. Although we have a Q&A session that is more official in nature, I'm even going to start with a question, so you can interrupt me because we want this to be useful and interactive. As Anna said, the idea would be to talk about the rights of migrants and how they are related to the use of force. So, taking into account yesterday's session, I would like to start by talking about the causes. So here's a question. Why would someone leave their country? You can open the mic, write in the chat, let us know.
Muy buenos días, Glenda Maradiaga de la
Morning,
Secretaría de Relaciones
Glenda
Exteriores del Gobierno
Maradiaga
Nacional de Honduras.
from the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Honduras. Many people leave and they are looking for a better life due to poverty or violence, recruitment, gangs, and or because somebody knows somebody who went abroad and they're doing better. So it's like keeping with the Joneses attitude a bit, the attraction because somebody they know did well. Also, I see here in the chat poverty, generalized violence, culture, family networks. Any others? So why is it important? Because when we talk about migration, we talk about mixed migration flows. This idea that people migrate due to different reasons and they may need different protections. And people who would have some rights recognized in international right, like those require international protection or who are with vulnerability situations like trafficking victims, minors, etc. So this idea that we had that someone leaves just for better economic future, it's increasingly complex and requires a more particular or nuanced analysis to know what type of protection we can have in international law. So migration movements or flows are usually related or recognized as people who are in a situation of vulnerability. And these vulnerable situations can be many, but they are usually because they don't have the documentation they need to become regular. So they usually prefer to use irregular alternate channels. So try to live in a more invisible manner to try to avoid migration control. However, you have other situations of vulnerability. If we're talking about someone who is a girl or requires international protection, women. So we have different situations of vulnerability that are mixed within the context of migration, and that is also important to take into account. So what or who are the people who need international protection or the subjects of international protection? Refugees, asylum seekers, those who are recognized as beneficiaries of complementary protection, and stateless people. So within the context of migration, we have specific protection international law because in our work with migrants, we can find ourselves in one of these situations. So quite quickly, the a refugee would be the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, recognizing someone is a refugee when they have founded fears of being persecuted for race, religion, nationality, gender, or belong to a social group or political affiliation, and also gender. But in the classic one, we don't have gender, but I've included here because we have seen it. And because of one of these motives, they cannot afford or they or don't want the protection of their countries. They are fleeing because they fear for their lives. They have the rights to be recognized for specific rights. Because when we're talking about the use of force, we have certain obligations regarding asylum that has to be or have to be taken into account. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is the classical definition that is accepted universally. And we have also the Declaration of Cartagena. In the 80s, Cartagena, we had this classic definition of refugees, not enough to support and provide assistance to most who need or are forced to leave their countries. So they expanded the definition of refugees. This is then the expanded definition for people who fear for their life security. And we have 5 new reasons: generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflict, mass violation of human rights, and other circumstances that have disturbed public order. And in this expanded declaration, even though it is a declaration that is not binding, many countries have adopted. So that is why it is binding then. Because when we're talking about protection to migrants or refugees, this extra protection is something that is very important to mention because it is expanded protection, allowing the recognition of people as refugees, much better than the classic definition. And also, we've seen the development of the concept of complementary protection that says the people may not fulfill all requirements to be recognized as refugees, but I cannot return them because their life or integrity may be compromised. They can be killed even though they do not fulfill the requirements of being refugees. So many countries have these complementary protections to provide help to these people. And this is from the obligation of non-devolution, non-return, because you cannot return somebody where their life can be in danger. And we've seen a lot of that in these last years, very illustrative. This had the International uh, Human Rights Commission, and she's from Jamaica. She was not able to return. She's basically detained for smoking marijuana, and they start a deportation process. And she says, you cannot return me to Jamaica because my life will be in danger, because I have HIV and I don't have the medication in my country. So if you return me to Jamaica, I'm going to be in a situation where I more than likely will die. So the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights indicated that she could not be deported because her life could be in danger. It wasn't because that she was going to be attacked, but because of her condition and the lack of resources to take care of it resulted in the same, the risk of death. So that would be also for non-returned and stateless people who are not recognized as being the nationals of any country. So they have no effective nationality. And when we are talking about this concept of international protection, they don't have the protection of their state, and others have to guarantee this. So there is very important protection that we need to afford them. What are these obligations? Well, we have already had the principle of non-devolution or non-rejection. For example, operations regarding use of force, it is very important to take into account that these people that require international protection, they need to have due process. And we need to know whether they require this protection or whether it should be guaranteed. So it is a very important principle. And also the access to due process of international protection. And another very important aspect is we need to guarantee all the rights, including social and economic rights. So this is special protection for those who require it. But when we're talking about migrants, and possibly with yesterday's session, I would like to ask you at the international level, we only have this International Convention of Migration Workers and their families. It is from 1990. It is in vigor until 2003 and still cannot receive particular cases because it still does not have the number of required ratifications. That would be the only international instrument specifically for migrant people. So just because of the image, what do you think are the countries that have ratified the convention, the blue ones or the orange ones? If you can open the mic, even better. I would say the orange ones. Oh, let's hope the orange one. That would be great, but no, it's just the blue one that have ratified this convention. It is nice to say, let's hope the um, orange ones would be the ones who ratify it. It is a bit worrisome that very few countries or and Australia, US, etc., are not ratifying it. Mainly the countries of destination, and we have different very interesting aspects in the region because we have also standards of human rights and also related to yesterday's session under international law. Migrants, do they have the same rights as non-migrants? And if not, somebody can tell me why they have the same rights. Any exception? Can they vote? That depends on each country's. But let's say in international law, do we have any exceptions? Only two exceptions in international law. One is political rights, in other words, to run for office and to vote. These are not the same, of course. And the second and very interesting is that countries have sovereignty to put the requirements they ask a foreign national for to enter the country. Do we need a visa? Do we need more permits for a certain nationality compared to others? Yes. So depends on each country, yes. And this has been allowed in international law. But in addition to that, they have the same rights as nationals. And that is why this is key. And this is very important because of non-discrimination. The right to equality and non-discrimination is very important. So, principle or main rights, migration is not a crime, is not a felony, maybe a misdemeanor, cannot be considered a crime, or the one that does it a criminal. Migrants have the same rights as nationals. And also separation on the one hand of migration control, and then the second, access to rights. And in other words, migrants have rights even though they are in irregular status. So a very good practice is to separate the authorities. For example, you have migration control, it's valid. But on the other hand, you will limit the migration control just to that authority. For example, I need to go to a hospital. I can go to the hospital without fear of the hospital uh, telling the migration authorities to come and get me. And so we need to have this unrestricted access to rights and separate migration or the enforcement of migration control. And also to have the logic of the presentation. And we have access to specific populations where we can have a relationship with the use of force. For example, being detained in migration control, some of the things that we've seen first is to have specific authority and the authority would not have most likely faculties for the use of force, and it is one of the best practices, only one authority or force in charge of migration control. We also have a presentation to start migration control. Another thing that is essential, we need to know whether there are people who have the need to international protection. If we have people that need protection, if they need um, medical assistance, we need to identify these needs. Another thing very important is to allow entrance to those who require international protection once they are under the control of authorities, and of course prohibiting torture. And it's very important, the right to information. People must know the procedure and to follow, and the rights that they have in the stage of migration control, they have to be observed. Another very important topic that we had in our welcome is the crimes that these migrants can be the victims of, violations of their own human rights. So we have best practices for these people so they may not need international protection, but they may need specific protections. For example, Monica Martinez would like to ask a question regarding this, regarding the previous slide. We would like to know about this different the steps. If you could go back a bit. We're talking about the rights to be guaranteed. These are identified, of course. We have them quite clear, but in order of importance, the order of this if there was a protocol, for example, presentation vis-a-vis the authority, we're talking about the right of international protection. How can we put this in practice? Can you tell us with the protocols that you have how we can do this? Very good product, very good question. For example, the first thing we would have to do is to allow entrance, identify those who require protection, and without doing protection without allowing for entrance, of course, it is impossible. So the first thing would be is to provide information to the people to be able to identify protections. People have these rights, so we need to provide this international protection, due process, and what we need to do. And also to provide a process of protection and asylum, we can have a complementary protection. So first, I would say access to territory, saying information, then access to procedures, presentation vis-a-vis the authorities. It is not necessarily the authorities that do migration control. Sometimes we need to channel that, and especially those who need to do the determinations, the different commissions that would help us, that would help us channel this. And we do not have this international protection. We can have, for example, a migration protocol for return. We would have then the proper authorities providing, for example, assistance. So this is not currently the correct order. I don't know whether I made myself clear.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes.
Gracias, Mónica.
Thank you, Monica.
Pensando en esto que estás diciendo y
Thinking
escuchando,
about what you're saying,
me parece que
I
lo que están
think
enfatizando aquí son
that what
los
we
derechos durante el
are
proceso de
emphasizing
detención.
are the
Bien decías,
rights
no toda
during
autoridad tiene la
the
facultad de
process
hacer
of
ese control
detention,
migratorio para detectar los
and
derechos de las
not
personas
everybody
migrantes.
has the right
Entonces,
to have
me
this
parece
migration
que con
control.
el tema de
So,
la canalización
so
hacia
channeling this
las personas que necesitan
to
protección
people
internacional,
who
pues
need
depende mucho
international
del
protection
procedimiento, porque
would depend on this
porque
order,
generalmente
because
estos
generally
migrantes no tienen
these
documentos
migrants
migratorios que
don't
les puedan
have
ingresar de manera
the
regular.
migration
Por
documents
lo
that they
tanto,
need.
de entrada ya tienes ahí como
So
primera barrera
you already have
de
this
no le
first
puedes permitir la entrada al
barrier
territorio porque
where
no
you
tienen
don't
documentos.
allow
Entonces,
them
ese
access
freno
to
o
the
esa barrera,
territory.
en el momento en el que no lo
So
permites dentro
this
del marco
barrier
jurídico, te lo canaliza
that
a
will
un
be channeled
procedimiento
into
administrativo, que es
an
el
administrative
procedimiento
procedure,
migratorio, de
which
donde
is the
tienes que
migration
estar
process,
la secuencia de
which you would
detención en
need
reclusorio,
require a whole
este
sequence
procedimiento
once again. To
habría
channel this process, we would have to
donde
make priorities
primero identificas
of whether we
si requiere
identify
el protector
first
internacional
if we
o si
need
está requisito su
international
seguridad,
protection,
dar
because if
identificaciones
required,
a su
you might not
consulado
be
o a
able
su
to
embajada,
provide notices
justo por un tema de
to
seguridad.
consulates or embassy
Entonces, me
just because
parece
of
que es
protection.
ahí
So
donde
this is where
entra como ese
we
orden de
see
prioridades
this
para
priority
garantizar
to
el acceso a todos los
guarantee
derechos, porque
access
algunos
to all
pueden
rights,
bloquear a
because
otros.
some can
Y me
block
parece que
others.
está un
So I
poquito ahí
think
como el dilema
we see
de qué pones
this
primero y qué
dilemma,
pones después, pero
what
sí
you see
el tema de
first
la entrada
or
al territorio
second,
es un tema
and the
que
entrance to the territory
estamos
is
hablando de
essential,
alguien que
central
cumple
in nature,
todos los requisitos para
because
entrar o no
we
en un
have somebody
procedimiento de
who
detención
would
administrativa.
be fulfilling or not the requirements
Mi
for
percepción es
administrative
esa.
um, activities. So thank you for sharing with us. It's very complicated. If you don't have the requisites, they cannot enter, but then you have the right to international protection. And this also depends on national legislations. But the most important aspect is to interview the person when they're trying to enter the territory, to try to identify these needs for international protection. Because many times they are not going to tell you, I'm a refugee. They don't always know about their rights, including the right to request the status of refugee. So the first point of contact with this person should be able to identify these needs and channel them to the corresponding authorities. So it's something that is essential for the access to territory. We need to have this possibility of starting the process. So we can see a couple of changes in the process, but in one first stage, we should be able to identify these needs for protection and the possibility of accessing these processes. Let's try to open the chat so we can continue if you need me. So, so we have another important thing that has to be taken into account as thought for international protection. And many times you have victims of crime, for example, of these people. And we have also good practices at the regional level. And we're talking about the possibility, for example, migration to see their process because they're victims of crime. And the people, we, for example, have someone who can indicate that they were victims of crime without the fear of being deported or subject of deportation. So these crimes do not become non-prosecuted. Another one, victims have specific rights for assistance and protection, and we need aspects that of protection that would facilitate transportation for medical services, which we've also seen, very interesting. And many times it is very important to have cooperation with organizations of civil society or international organizations to support the victims. So to have this proper collaboration, and this is very important. And finally, non-revictimization, of course. In this process, we must have people not suffer the same trauma again.
Ay, gracias, Moni. Disculpa,
Once
es que no había
again,
contestado tu
sorry,
transición,
that
entonces
is
me
very
gustaría saber,
interesting.
en este caso, cuando
In
hablas
this
de
case, when we are
protección,
talking
digamos, a una
about
persona
protection
migrante que
to
fue
victims,
víctima de un delito
let's
en un
say a
país de
migrant
tránsito,
that
en
was the
este país de
victim
arriba o el país
of a
de destino o en otro país, ¿cómo hacen para,
crime in the country of
o
transit
sea, si el delito fue cometido en otro país,
if
¿cómo
the
hacen
crime was
para
committed
tener
elsewhere?
esta coordinación
How do
con
you
la policía?
coordinate that? A
Estamos
great question. I have it a little bit later on because migration, as I said before, it's regional and international. Access to justice in one single country is not enough. We have two ideas: portable rights. People have rights in their country of origin, transit, and destination. And we have the need to create transnational mechanisms for access to justice and to fight impunity. We have the external mechanism that Mexico has signed with countries of Central America. For example, if a migrant disappeared in Mexico, their family can go to the Mexican consulate in their country and follow the process there. It would be different, but the access to justice would then not be limited to the not presence of the person in that country or of the family. It is a great topic. I mean, it requires innovation. We need international cooperation so we can have access to transnational justice. Thank you. And finally, another very important topic regarding development regarding children and teenagers, of which we see more and more along the migration route. First, non-detention. First, we have two essential documents. First, consultative opinion of the Red Cross, and the committee took observations on children and best practices on how to assist
migrant children. We are talking about no detention because of the effect it has. They can be channeled to an authority that specializes in children, non-separation of the family, understood with a very broad concept, not only to have, for example, the bond between mother and children, for example, and what we have in all processes, the best interest of the child. So these are some of standards and best practices that we have if they have been separated. For example, the father left, and then you have the process of reunification should be guaranteed. So generally speaking, we should have this, and this is very important as a summary for the protection of migrants. We need visible security services, special needs that will look for the protection more than control, to be able to separate migration control with the access to rights so they can access, for example, interpretation, for example, if they don't speak the language, and other types of assistance so they can exercise their rights. Something that is very important is to be able to exercise your rights without the fear of being deported. And another very important topic is to prohibit migration controls in places where people are requesting rights. For example, public services like hospitals, the courts of law, even in shelters where people are looking to exercise their rights. We should not have migration control, because if you do migration control there, people will forfeit the exercise of these rights. It is best practice of many countries, but about 1 or 2 years ago, the International Commission published some international principles, and in Principle 76, they put this as something important, regionally speaking. So, in addition to some countries doing it, we have a principle that has to be respected for all migrants. And of course, mechanisms for accountability are also very important. And finally, to talk about this concept of shared responsibility. Very important, because in the Convention of 1951 on the conditional status of refugees, one of the most important aspects that we've had, we're talking about the protection of mobility. This recognized that there are countries that have a greater migration load, if you will, that they have to respond more closely to these issues of migration or refugees due to their geographical position. So maybe due to lack of resources, personnel, and others, they cannot be protected as would be the best case. So we have these shared responsibility, recognizing migration, the situation of refugees is not a situation of a single country, but international, regional situations requiring these types of responses. So we have a greater number of people. The country can have cooperation and support from international community to try to address it. And it's part of the spirit of these talks. I am sorry to interrupt you.
Podemos interrumpirte.
Claro,
Yes, you
adelante.
said we can interrupt. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Can you say the name of the document for children of the convention that allows following up the issues of crimes from conscience? Children and teenagers, we have two: consultative opinion on migrant children of the International uh, Convention, and then we have a general observation 2, 3, 4, and observation 3 and 4 on the Committee of the Rights of the Child and Migrant Workers on migrant children. And the other one would be a transnational mechanism, which is a mechanism for support abroad. If not, the institute can help me. Yeah, foreign support mechanism. I can also share with you. And this access to justice is a good example of these transnational mechanisms and shared responsibility, and how we can talk about more regional solutions, and basically to go to the use of force. Very interesting cases. First of all, the use of force in Nadesh against the Dominican Republic, which is a case where 30 Haitians were in with a truck on the Dominican Republic. So there was no police control, and they shot them. One person was dead and many others were killed. And what's important is what the Inter-American Court said, is that migrants were not a real threat, or so the use of force was not warranted, and they were talking about these principles in a more detailed manner. And of course, we needed to use less aggressive means to control transit and migration control. Instead of using force, they could have speed bumps or these devices to puncture tires for this control to take place without having to use force. And another thing that was said was that since force had been used and we had wounded people, they needed medical services, and their families had to be notified, and force being used with migrants. And we had another that was relatively new, which is Nicaragua, similar case. A truck that doesn't stop at control, they get shot, and many people were wounded and a couple were killed. So the International Court said was the use of lethal force immigration control will always be contrary to the principles on the use of force. Shoot to kill immigration controls will always be contrary to these principles. These are the two main causes that we have, causes or cases against the use of force. When we're talking about international principles on the use of force, I'm going to also give you the link in the chat on one of the principles, which is 65, says it is a very big text, but says that border controls have to be more oriented to the protection and safety of migrants. The use of force has to be the exception, not the rule, and proportional and reasonable and necessary for the objective. We need to follow the principle of legality. We need to know who doesn't have the faculty, and what was said in Rochesaña, that in under no circumstances the lethal use of force can be used for these purposes. So these principles are going to be clear later on because Anne is going to talk about them, but this is what we have on migrants. And as you can see, these two ones in the summary, I do not know whether you have any questions regarding these two cases. And then I'm going to give you the documents. Anna, you have the floor. Thank you. While I'm sharing my screen, I'm asking you, as we've said before, we don't have access to the chat, but you can always interrupt me. If you have a question, please let me know. I'm trying to, yes, we can see it. Okay, you can see it on full screen. And now we are going to talk about the rights, causes, guarantees, and other aspects regarding migration. We've had many preparatory meetings, but we talked about the use of force against migrants. These are the 8 items I'm going to discuss. Okay, we're going to try to touch them all, but briefly, the use of force, which is what we're going to be saying in all sessions. We have no protocols that are specific at a national level or at a country level on the use of force against migrants. So what I'm saying is that whatever we have in our legislation that is applicable to the use of force will be mandatory because it does not depend on the person or status of the person against which this is used, but the situation as a whole. So traditionally, those who use this power conferred by the state, which is not always power, but a responsibility, but also their duty. So what does this entail? What do we mean by this? The use of force, and as we can see it, this is going to be done only or exclusively for 3 reasons: to prevent felony or crime, to keep public order, or to provide assistance or help in situations of emergency. And we are going to say that we could have the possibility, for example, a temporary issue, the authority or the person in charge of exercising this faculty of the law with the intention of keeping order or limit an escalation. And the officer in charge of enforcing the law, it is a document of the General Assembly of the UN. It is the Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Agents. It's from 1979, which says that officers in charge of enforcing the law, they are police force. They can be security forces, police forces at the national level or even municipal level. But it also clarifies that in a certain context and in several contexts, and we have seen this before, many exercise police force duties and they have to be with the future uh, principles. These following principles have to be obeyed when they are um, doing their functions. We still have a course. We're still studying some of them. What would happen with private security controls contractors that use force, not only with migrants, because in some contexts they go when we have private security details, private security personnel, for example, in along the routes where migrants travel. Can they use force? No, they're not within this definition right now, the inter-American system. And because there was a question a couple of years ago, I think there was a consultation whether private contractors can use force. Most likely the answer will be no. But you cannot deny this reality. So it is going to be a document says under which conditions can these private contractors use force, and we've said it in many countries and also within the Inter-American Court. In any case, if these people were to use force, the state would be responsible for that because they are the main guarantors of the rights of people. We're talking about human rights in international instruments and also the duty to provide support, and we have guarantees of protection. Another question, what would happen in some cases where we have seen that the migration authorities themselves are the ones using force. And their authority is migration control, support. So they can support law enforcement officers if there was a situation where maintaining public order is needed, or if they had a crime. But we've seen from the start of this session, we may use force because there was a commission of a crime, not to support this. So this migration control. So they are not the definition of officers in charge of enforcing the law. And the state would be responsible, again, for guaranteeing these conditions, and we can guarantee this and try to enforce the law. And when we have seen prison personnel that have been using force, they're saying they are not law enforcement officers, but we understand there are certain contexts where force may be needed. As second line, after the law enforcement officers, and two, that they receive training. And in general, we know that we can have situations in these centers. We are trying to have them trained, but the use of force, it is not theirs. They don't have this authority. So if we had scenarios to solve regarding this, national, international, it would be the same criterion. Migration authorities don't have the authority to use force. in the end, something happened, we would have responsibility by the state to guarantee the life integrity and the rest of the rights of migrants. Regarding the use of force, I've said it before, the use of force is authority of the state. And what we have in more than 90 countries where we have a presence and dialogue with authorities of countries where we don't even have a presence, we have over 130. We have seen this dialogue and our own national authorities have said and have imposed on us, and the population have accused us for not exercising force. And not only is the authority, but also responsibility that has to be exercised under certain principles that we are going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about what was Monica was saying about Haitians, about what we saw in the Dominican Republic. Very different violence from the use of force. Remember that. It is not aggression by an officer that is complying with the law. But the civil population should be able to use it. And but not because of that, we are going to say that an officer in charge of enforcing the law, they can have arbitrary or excessive use of force. Yes, and they can have this use of force and the rights that apply. And apply everything that regulates the exercise of this authority. And we have a clear definition of the role of security forces, armed forces, laws, organic laws, administrative laws that define the competencies of certain ministries of security, of defense, in case migration authorities depend on these cases. And this is very important. And the ICRC has a special interest in having an effective system of investigation and punishment, because many times this impunity appears to be a reason why we have seen an increase or these abuses have not been stopped, which have gone to judicial instances. We also have international instances, organic laws, and the different authorities. This is applicable law in the national legislation. And we have mentioned that it should be established for the treatment of these populations, because ACSC also knows we have a list of authorities and it's not clear who has to do what. Usually first responders are police officers and migration of authorities that exercise control functions, migration control functions. And this scenario can also have others, although not first responders, but with a type of the commission of a crime, we could see then a list of authorities that are interinstitutionally coordinated, possibly, including what the functions are for each. applicable law at the regional level on the use of force, especially when we're involving the right of life and the physical integrity. And we have the American Convention, the Pact of San Jose. There's a lot of jurisprudence here. We have a couple of cases, and these are part of the sources of rights. And also the Inter-American system has also addressed these issues on the protection of migrants, and also the code of conduct for law enforcement officers, and even more important, and the principles, basic principles on the use of force and firearms. Although they are not a convention or a treaty that is binding, they have said it's not directly binding, but according to these instruments, I have the right to life, to integrity. So there are legal effects that are transcendent because they regulate when a force can be used, what scenarios, and how many people. So the same thing as we said before, the prison system, we can have, for example, an instrument for the prison system. And we have seen that international tribunals and courts have also been held. And the over 25 cases that we have on the use of force, where we have one or two, we have a couple related or very few related to human rights. And the principles, as I mentioned, and I'm going to say it to avoid any confusion, that the work experience in other countries in which we operate, we have the five principles that we have on the screen. Right now, we only see three in the Inter-American system that are part of these five, but the name given is different. So the name may be different, but the content is very important. And the same, we're talking about legality and proportionality or need. And these are the three pillars. So legality, need, and proportional response. We need to develop a couple more, which first one would be precaution, as I'm going to be saying later, would be the preparation planning stage. So if we see mass movements of people, we need to have previous coordinations to know what to do in these cases. And this is also mentioned by the Inter-American Court as a principle of need. Then we have the principle of responsibility, and it has been admitted in the principle of legality to investigate, to see who was involved in this particular operation in the unit or in the police station, coordinating or receiving information, and to the personnel who was in the operation and who saw any violation of human rights and didn't do anything. So it's the principle of responsibility. We see the principle of responsibility and precaution regarding needs. So what is this about really? We need to have a legal framework or administrative framework that says who, in which situations, with which guns, in which case, and how many people were using force. Also, the dialogue that we have with several authorities, and we've seen it in the upper echelons of the hierarchy, that the personnel in a situation of stress or a riot, for example, where we see uh, guns, for example, or shooting, the less margin of discretionality, the best, their conduct would be. The reaction would be to evoke these guidelines. And we also have to say that each situation is unique and we will not be able to regulate each scenario. But the greater the clarity we have in the mechanisms that can be used, we are going to respect the principle of legality. So what is legality? What is being, for example, uh, punished by law? Or do we have a law regulating this faculty? Do we have a protocol, constitutional rule? Well, for ICRC, whether we have, or as long as we have a regulatory framework, a law, a manual, guidelines, or even directive on the use of force that is known by all, that should be exercised within the institutions. We've been more and more strict as long as there is a juridical framework and we have jurisprudence, we need to have a law because we don't have the same weight when you have a protocol compared to a law. So, with the principle of legality, regarding the need, the use of force should always be the last recourse, and especially when we're talking about firearms, and only to protect a life, and to be an exceptional measure for the attainment of a legitimate goal. And in the Dominican Republic's case, the court explained in detail that it was bus with Haitians, also with Dominicans. They don't stop at the control point. They fire at the vehicle's tires. The vehicle rolls over, and you see 2, 3 people who are hurt, and they wanted to explain and had said, don't, there was a attempt against life and there was lethal use of force by Dominican um, officers, and the officers were in danger because we had the bus that was not possible to turn it over. So we had injuries, we had deaths, and even we had a manipulation of the scene because they tried to put the bus back over. And it's very interesting case. We're also talking about due procedure in this case, and very recommended. So we're talking about the legitimate objective. You didn't know there was a crime being committed. And migration control was also not your purview. You did not have a legitimate case for the use of force. And that's why the state was condemned. And also what was said, once you have reached your objective, if you had a situation where you need the use of force. Once you have no need for the use of force, you have no right to continue with that use of force. And you have to have differentiated use of force. So we have to think about alternative means to the use of force. For example, just the presence, negotiation, talking, or tactics, or tools that are less lethal, unless we have a threat. But remember, in case of a crime being committed, so that would be last recourse, we have the issue of proportionality, and we see then the proportionality of tools and also numeric, the force and the damage has to be proportional to the legitimate objective and the crime being committed. Even in the case of they are escaping. But what if they were migrants that were committing a crime? There was no enough. There were no evidence. There was no evidence that a crime was actually being committed at the moment, or there was a danger posed by the migrants. So there was no really reason for the use of force. So you have to minimize risk, you have to reduce them, and one of the problems, we need to provide constant training. And I also said before, we need to inform when we have a person who is killed. The first one to be informed has to be the commander, and we have to justify the risk of or the threat. And we've also seen in other instances, and we've seen international instances that we may use to investigate the case. And we may have to call on you so you tell us what happened. And we need to have punishment with the aim that the issue never repeats itself. The model of the use of force and the one that you see here, any action should have a reaction. If somebody is cooperating, verbalizing should be enough. But we may have the use of potential lethal force. But this should be something that you have to use progressively. So some people prefer the other model, the model below, because you don't need to exhaust the previous level. If there is a threat to life, verbalization might not be the first line of item that has to be um, exhausted. So you can have a differentiated but non-gradual use of force, and we need a law. We need to understand how people react. So the commander must know how their people react in different scenarios. Also in our context, when we have mass movements of migrants. So we're having more and more experience. And so how we are going to have the reaction, what type of arms or weaponry or equipment. And we've seen it also before with some, for example, equipment, dissuasion effect that we could have, that we would be able then to know about the applicable norms, margin of discretionality, for example. They're trying to prevent abuse and also talking about this later, as Monica mentioned. We have people that are hurt to guarantee care. Authorities will have to meet and have analysis of best practices and lessons learned and to guarantee measures. For example, assistance, care, guarantees, and trying to have this not to be repeated. And since May 2020, from the Committee of the Red Cross, and we are talking about the type of equipment and weaponry, especially when we're talking about public order and in operations to basically enforce the law. We're talking about those who are that would not be causing unnecessary damage. We have another section of the use of less lethal weapons and the use of forbidden equipment. In the same scenarios where we see the use of force, where we see a person or a group of people whose intention is not to commit a crime, the impression would be very important. Could be anxiety, fear, and this was just for migration control that can result in violence. So we have varied scenarios, the lack of a legal framework. We also see it in several countries that we need training and equipment and extra legal factors. Will always have a political and even news effect in the perception that we have regarding migrants. And to finish, and for not all of them to be questions on a topic, but I just want to share with you an experience in 2019 of the ICRC that is with the police forces in 2019. This was centered on migration. So we had different dialogue tables or round tables on this and how we can protect human rights during this process of the conclusions that we had, and we can share it because we're not going to talk about country specific, because of course we have also a confidentiality issue. But of course, the police officers say, okay, we're first responders. Many times, the issue with migrants is not with us, is with what we see them, the protocol, that we needed protocols to detain migrants, but we need protocols for assistance. It has to be the result of regional cooperation. We insisted a lot. Migration is not a crime. Never look at a person just based on migration status. And the ideal would be to privilege this alternative means, the models, and we have seen people in different encounters. It would be great to have police coordination models, and not only for a given authority, but also have civil institutions, agents of the state, because the state may not have the capability at a given time, but they can talk to other organizations. They can talk to the Red Cross, for example, other institutions that can provide assistance where the state cannot make it. And at one time, we did not have massive flows, but and when we had it, we had a provisional relief by some churches opening their installations or their premises, and all of those who exercise force, in addition to training, we need to sensitize them regarding the vulnerability that migrants have and who are the holders of rights. This was in 2019. We had over 20 countries from Latin America, and some of them that I have just shared on how they are perceived. You have to see that from the eyes of the police force that is being represented and the communication that we need to give migrants. So that would be all at the moment for my presentation. If you have any questions, we already have shared some of the sources.
Muchísimas gracias, Ana Luisa y Mónica.
Thank you, Ana Luisa and Monica. Very interesting. We wanted to take this opportunity for some dialogue. Can you please share the presentations with us in the chat? You can, of course, upload them. We have a first question. What suggestions would the ICRC have regarding the use of force when we have a mass and regular flows in the region?
Yo empiezo por ahí.
Let's start there. ICRC will always say reduce humanitarian risks, and I think this is the time to talk about planning. In Central America, we have a country that has an institutional protocol on what to do. If we have the first, let's say, ring, as they call it, the police forces, and then the second would be the presence of we're talking about the use of force. We've seen many people who want to go through, and they want just a better life for them. And how can we foresee if this can escalate to violence? So this may result in the use of violence. So foresight and planning and clearly defined roles as well, of course, could provide better results. Thank you, Ana Luisa. Also, for dialogue purposes, we would also give the floor to the National Migration Institute, Director of Verification of Migration. Mr. Arellano, you have the floor Thank you to all the panelists and who are in each of the countries that are connecting. A general comment, we have to recognize the participation of Monica, especially regarding the causes of migration, because it's not so much being able to understand them, also including international protection. Mexico has been very involved in that, and we see the different laws of the countries, which is very relevant. The general principles of migration. We know migration is not a crime. Regularization, we have the rights, any polemics, and any administrative issues. When we see then this funnel include access to justice in Mexico, we are making big efforts in Mexico in this regard, and the biggest challenge is access to justice, reparation of damage of the different victims, and of course to maintain this accessibility or access to justice and respect of human rights. Priority then should be, especially taking into account the previous reforms in Mexico, reforms to our law on migration. Article 52 is one of the most controversial that we have regarding its observance. This is where we should collaborate openly as an institution with international agencies, NGOs, as well as our own institutions. It is a huge challenge. Mexico determined, and it has to be recognized because it's historical, that it does not have any child or teenager in the migration stations. It is a very important reform which aims at the protection of people. Our country right now is in a crucial time with the region regarding shared responsibility. This is also very cutting edge. We are trying to contribute to the safety of people on all aspects of the inhabitants of the different countries, and those are, of course, in aspects of mobility. We have important challenges, such as the use of force, which Ana Luisa says, and there are many principles, there are many things that are proposed, especially regarding the exceptional character. These are terms that have to be present, proportional use of force, because use of force, it is the least desirable. So we need to know what to do. Mexico has also made efforts in its legislation. The law on the national system of public security, and we have a law, the national law on the use of force, where we have most of the conditions for this use of force based on the principles. And before, during, and after the use of these resources, we have many challenges. We have seen our panelists will provide a lot more insight. Thank you, Mr. Arellano, for this feedback. Very useful for the next part, facilitated by Monica and Annalisa, to make the best use of what we have left. in terms of time.
Las preguntas podríamos incluso compartirlas en el
We
chat.
can even share the questions in the chat.
Con gusto las comparto.
Gracias. Pero la intención acá es generar la participación, ¿no? Ver
What we want here is to generate participation best practices that we have
de los países, en las personas aquí
in the countries and the people who are with us. So yeah, let's share. And we have 4 questions. The most, well, the ones that we're most interested in, and best practices that are also mentioned to be able to share with us the different challenges we've had when assisting migrants, and any best practices that we could have in this particular space. So there you have the questions in the chat.
Ya sea con base en las preguntas o también cualquier país
Based on the question,
que desee también con base en la
or any participants who would like
hacer su aporte.
to take the floor, and maybe it's not a best practice, but you think it could be, this could also be very valuable.
Hola, hola.
Hello,
Adelante, Joana. Gracias. Buenos días.
Bueno, gracias.
Si te identificas
Siempre-
rápidamente.
can
Me-
you
me-
identify yourself quickly?
Pero a veces estamos como tímidos.
Yeah,
Bueno, primero que nada,
well,
felicitar
first,
la exposición de
congratulations
compañera,
on the presentations. They were excellent.
su exposición y el manejo
And
no
management
manejo corporal porque
of the body language.
muy difícil a veces encontrar
It is difficult to find
que tengan una
people
posición de
who
trabajo
have
muy
such a great
excelente.
way
Yo
to
quisiera decir
provide this type of information. In question number 1,
lo hemos dicho muchas veces en los retos,
and we've said it more than once, in the challenges that we have language barriers, and also in culture. And we're talking about culture in bold because we see cultures where women are completely invisible, especially regarding the power of the male, especially the spouse. So it's very difficult for us as women to be able to have to respect this culture. It's a culture, and women cannot talk because there's a man, or they cannot say anything because it is the man who talks. So it can be suffocating a bit, and sometimes you see and you fail to accept this. Okay, it's a culture. And maybe in future women will be able to have a better conditions within their culture. But for me, it is one of the biggest challenges, really. And as a woman, all more. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Joana. No sé
Thank
si
you,
Mónica o
Joanna.
desean
Monica and
comentar.
Lucia would like to make a comment. Thank you for the comment. And it's something we did not see in the presentation. It is so difficult when we're talking about different cultures and having to, or for them to access this new world. It is so important to be able to get trained about the countries of origin, their main needs, what can we do to provide them better service. And it requires a lot of time and effort and participation. And I would also like to tell you regarding the use of force How many cases have we heard about that women are the victims of violence or sexual abuse, for example, by authorities because of this condition? Because we still see in this century, we still have a long way to go.
Efectivamente. Tenemos a Glenda Maradiaga de Honduras.
We have Glenda Maradiaga from Honduras. You have the floor. Welcome all. I'm going to give a bit more to what Johanna said, and I want to congratulate Monica. And what really calls your attention, it's very important. It is so important in these spaces. Sometimes these presentations can be a bit monotonous, but it was much more interactive. I mean, everybody wanted to participate. It was great. And regarding culture, we have the culture of food. We had a Honduran who did not like Mexican food. I think he was also in the mean. And so it doesn't have to be extreme. We had Jamaicans who we had them here. They didn't want our food. They didn't like it. Under all these cultures, and we have that, for example, as Hondurans, we are always sometimes we don't have the best or most tidy way of keeping tabs. So in the different countries where you are in transit, it could be something that the other country does not like. And what we saw with Johanna, with the male chauvinism that we still have in these countries of origin. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Honduras, Glenda, por la...
Thank you, Honduras, Glenda. And also to tell you regarding the issue of food and how it is so important if somebody does not like the food, so it does not affect the perception of migrants. We have comments in social networks against migration. I mean, they don't want to integrate into our country, etc. So we also have to focus a bit on how to handle cultural aspects so we don't have more discrimination or problems. It is something that has to be taken into account. And I mean, well, I mean, some people, yeah, don't like food, even though it may be delicious for us. I think we have from Honduras.
Adelante, Karen.
Karen, you have the floor. The National Forum for Migration in Honduras. Really, I want to congratulate Anna and Monica and all of you who have been talking regarding the issue of human mobility, and especially in these regional spaces. So regarding these challenges, it is very important to retake this notion of the challenges. The caravans that we've seen over the years, and Honduras is the first country where they are born. And we know the causes, and we saw it in Monica's presentation. Like it or not, it is palliative and it is being escalated constantly. We saw in the presentation the issue of the protection and international protection, but unfortunately in our countries, we do not verify or give due process to this. We are also cognizant that we have a lot of protocol and bilateral agreements for safe, orderly, and regular migration. But from my experience, we are not able to have all these processes and mechanisms and translate them into actual services. We are aware of international right, but we also like political willingness by the states, and this should be binding, especially not only the border, but the people moving across border. They can be forced displacement, climate change. Our countries right now have a system of sales per territory, and also, like it or not, of climate change that we've seen in the region. This allows us to understand it's not that people really want to leave their country. The conditions and the situations that they do not improve, they force you to do it. So we need to give this differentiated protection that are required by mobility. And also those who are in the country, we have Venezuelan, Colombians, and many others. And what's happening with them? There is a lot of violation of rights, and we're always trying to have the rights to be enforced. And in addition to this issue of culture or gender that we as organizations have, we have to have that competency. So these spaces also have to take into account these challenges. We talk a lot, but many times we are more sometimes words than actual action. So we see it a lot in different
Muchas
countries.
gracias a usted, Karen, de Rocom.
Thank you, Karen from RNCOM.
Antes de pasar a la siguiente pregunta, no sé si Mónica o Ana Luisa
So,
quieren complementar
Monica,
algo.
would you like to comment anything? I would really like to thank you for participation. One thing is the rights that we have, international rights, and the rights of legislations, but from talk to walk is something that we have to do. And not only what we have, but what we have pending. What we're talking about, forced migration due to climate change. They are some topics that we have to go in deeper with other mechanisms and protection. So yeah, thank you for bringing all this to the table.
Gracias. Tenemos una
We
intervención
have
de Dios, Oria,
an
Juan de Dios.
intervention of Juan de Dios.
Si
We
gusta
have a few
hacer una
minutes.
consulta al aire,
So if you want, you can take the floor and ask a question or your comment. Good afternoon, all. We have some noise just to complement question 4A formulated by Monica. The government of Mexico in 2019 implemented the action plan for migrant caravans. So we had a process for reception of people that were in this irregular mass migration group, where you had hydration and information. We had also interinstitutional collaboration, and we were able to collaborate with this plan of attention for migrant caravans. And we had other measures that allowed the identification of these migrant people. And this will allow us for best practices in the region. And that would be my comment for this forum.
Muchas gracias a ustedes, Juan de Dios. Mónica,
Thank you, Juan de Dios. Monica,
complementar.
also to thank about
Es
best
interesante también
practices,
porque, digamos, en el tema de las caravanas,
and also in the issue of caravans, we've had different public policies has allowed access
es un ejemplo de que se podría hacer distinto.
because it is an example that you can be different.
Gracias. Karen, creo que tu mano es de la intervención anterior.
I think your hand is from previous intervention.
Otra intervención, pueden anotarla en el
If we
chat.
have another intervention, you can have it in the other chat.
Están invitados todavía en los próximos minutos.
Luis, no sé si puedo
Claro.
preguntar algo.
Can
Adelante.
I ask for something, Luis?
Me llamó mucho la atención la intervención del
It
compañero
really
del
called my
Instituto
attention the
Nacional de
intervention
Migración
of my
de
colleague from the
México,
Mexico's
a
National
conocer
Migration
el
Institute,
artículo 52,
talking about
sobre
Article
la- no sé si
52,
el artículo que lo establece,
establishing
de la no detención de niños
the
y adolescentes
non-detention of
llegando, ¿verdad?
migrant
Y me
children.
gustaría un poquito que
So I would like a
realmente,
bit of an
después de esto,
explanation
¿verdad? De que ya no existe la
on whether
detención
this
de
is
los niños y
happening,
adolescentes en estos centros
that we don't have this,
detención que México tiene, o cuál ha sido la
or
dinámica que
what
actualmente
the
están
dynamic is
realizando
that we
para
have.
que los niños no estén pues tanto tiempo en estos centros,
So
¿verdad?
children are not
O de una u otra
in these
manera
centers
han
so
mejorado,
much.
la atención a esta
We've
población,
seen
pero que
better
tan
care for this population.
practícalo, ha sido pues desde el
So has it
punto de
been
vista
practical?
y si también a los niños se les permite
And have we've seen this differentiated care being given to these children? Many children are leaving due to the situation that they do not want to be part of gangs, or they're caught between gangs, for example, that are fighting for territory, etc. Because I did not understand how we are, or how you are dealing with this situation of children and teenagers in these detention centers. Well, colleagues from the National Migration Institute, you are most welcome to answer that question or elaborate. Effectively, our legislation was modified last year. We had different reforms which entered into force on January 11th. As Migration Institute in Mexico, we trained all personnel on this reform. So our colleagues and the personnel of the Migration Institute in these reforms, we had the tools to serve the guidelines that we have. Most relevant is the protection of children and teenagers and integrated assistance for people within the context of mobility, and taking into account this trigger question, Mexico, in the flow of caravans of 2018, where we had 14,000 people across Mexico, we had integrated aid. And in 2018, 2020, we had migration premises that had to be done with the pandemic. We need to replicate this. This is not going to be finishing soon, in a region at least. And Mexico has permanent efforts with assisted return. as we had that recently. Our colleagues' question regarding the law prohibits having children in migration installations, specifically. And the Institute of Migration is developing with the National DIF and the Federation the creation of integrated centers, integrated assistance centers for migrant children and their families. And in a few years, we are going to, in a few days, we are going to make the announcement, which is very pertinent to our institution. Our national commissioner will be making the announcement. Thank you. We are being asked when this officially ends. We end at in about 20 minutes at most. So we really thank you for being with us until now. So, Brenda Maridaga from Honduras. Again, thank you so much, Ms. Wilson. The question by Karen was very important as is a question for the Mexican National Migration Institute because how they did this change. For us, returns of these children and adolescents have taken a bit more time. Before we worked differently with detention centers. So we already had the liaisons with the centers, so we knew where the children were. These changes have made this more difficult for us to know where they are. So can we have more effective mechanisms so we can take less time? So effectively, Mexico is making great efforts in assisted returns and as humanitarian flights. And this is true. And this is due to the increase of migrant children and adolescents. And you know, most in the panel know that we've seen an exponential growth in the flow of these children and even families. And it's been a bit slow, even with the consulates that are making great efforts to represent their fellow citizens, but also the national systems. We are currently being overwhelmed by this spike in flows. But I think that in the next few weeks, possibly months, we will see a more regular situation. So we can continue with these dynamics.
Muchísimas gracias, maestro Arellano. ¿Alguna otra intervención?
Any other intervention?
¿Alguna consulta, comentario?
Any questions or comments?
Mónica, no sé si quieres agregar algo.
Mónica?
Bueno, pues nada, muchas gracias por todo, por la atención.
You know, really thank you for the best practices and the challenges. And I think there is a lot to do in terms of regional initiatives for the protection of migrants. And thank you again for the invitation. And once again, congratulations to you. And I think that you are going to be working in future with us because people have really liked your presentations. Gustavo Pineda, coordinator of the working group on irregular migration, irregular and mass migration. Well, thank you, Luis Alonso. And thank you all for your participation, and Elisa, Monica, for your excellent presentations and for inviting us to think about these best practices on the use of force and talking about regional strategies. And to close this space, first, that with the collaboration of the International Committee of the Red Cross, thank Oliver, Monique, and Ana Luisa for their great support. Also Executive Secretariat and follow-up and moderation. And also on behalf of the Mexican PPT, and thank you all. And I would like just to take this, that on Friday we will have, not tomorrow, but Friday, we will have the third session, which will be facilitated by the IOM and which will discuss assisted return within the context of crisis. It's a very pertinent topic, which we hope you will be with us to discuss. Especially assisted return is an issue that is very present, and that during COVID, we saw how these exercises of return were stretched to the limit. And from the Secretariat of the Interior of Mexico and the Office of Migration, we consider it is important to continue generating spaces such as these to build values, best practices, standards, to establish cooperation dynamics between the countries and be able to assist migrants with full respect of their exercise of human rights, and also to know best practices on the use of force, and member countries, I think we will be able to build on them to have better strategies to address all the different issues regarding migrants. And we have also to understand the context of xenophobia and discrimination, as well as understanding why migrants leave their countries of origin and usually try to go north in this continent, and the obligation of the governments to guarantee the protection of human rights with a dignified or decent treatment without prejudice. And in the case of today, to trying to meet international standards on the use of force. And I think it's necessary, as said today, that this training reach those who are the first line of contact with migrants, especially regular migrants who are in a greater vulnerable situation since they are traveling in a clandestine manner. And as the ICRC said, because they are people who do not know the legal frameworks that protect their rights. So the state, public servants, have the obligation to provide that information and access to all their rights and the knowledge to the different frameworks, legal frameworks that provide for their respect and enjoyment. We are currently building or working on building regional frameworks with a perspective of equality, because this is a regional issue. We cannot think that this is a country-only focus. It's a regional focus. We've talked about shared responsibility, which is the basis of this of the way we work, and this PPT is committed to respecting the rights of all migrant populations, which is an essential principle to fight prejudice and denigrating expressions against them, and also to try to fight all associated criminal activities to which migrants are exposed. And with the need of protection of this irregular mass migration flows, we reiterate the importance of working together jointly for better strategies. And from the Working Group on Irregular Mass Migration, we exhort the countries of the RCM to strengthen every day the principles of equality and non-discrimination, of measured use of force, and the suitable identification of the protection needs according to migrant profiles, because migrants are those who are suffering discrimination. We hope that today's and yesterday's and Friday's presentations will be beneficial, fruitful for you in your daily work. We hope that this training activity has a positive effect in each of the member countries, that this knowledge is reproduced, and that we maintain the commitment that not make our work, the use of force in our work, something regular, but try to substitute it by other protocols like protection and referral. This work has not ended today. We have other activities for the rest of the years to provide follow-up, complementary activities to structure regional strategies and protocols. That is why it is important for countries to try to look at these tools in the different spheres for the respect and protection of human rights. This PPT believes that respecting human rights of migrants is always or should always be above any political agenda. And with these reflections, I would like to thank all and close today's session, and would like to remind you that on Friday, in other words, the day after tomorrow, we will be back again. Thank you, Luis Alonso.
Gustavo. Y
Thank you, Gustavo. You said it. See you next Friday. Same link that we had today, and same time, 9 a.m. Central America, 10 a.m. Panama and Mexico. We will keep the chat open, so those who need to download the presentation can do so. Remember, since it is a training session, these workshops will be posted on in the YouTube channel of the RCM. Thank you all, the support team and the coordination of the work group of regular mass migration of the Secretariat of the Interior of Mexico. Thank you all. See you on Friday. Have a great rest of the day.